Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about the second part of the Woods chapter on conflict. And the text begins in the section that begins responses to conflict by talking about violence as a response to conflict. And certainly violence is a way to end conflict relatively quickly, but there's tons of clinical research that shows that violence only causes mistrust and damages relationships. So a big part of what this class is about using communication and using words to avoid having to use violence as a response to conflict or as a response to any situation. So not only does the text encourage you not to use that approach, I very much encourage you not to use that approach. I've oftentimes said that the first person to throw a punch is the person who's lost the argument. So you need to continue to use your words and to argue. The next section there deals with 4 different types of responses, specific types of responses to conflict. And I want to briefly summarize some of those and encourage you to read through that section of the chapter. The first is the exit response. The exit response is just literally kind of throwing your hands up and saying, that's it, I don't want to talk about this anymore, we're done discussing this, I'm out. And you either physically exit from the place where the conflict is happening, or you mentally and psychologically kind of check out of that conflict. The second response is the neglect response. And in the neglect response, we see communication which is characterized by statements such as, you're making a mountain out of a molehill, or there isn't really a disagreement here, or you're creating a problem where none exists. The neglect response essentially says, you feel that way, but I don't feel that way, and I'm going to neglect your feelings, and I'm going to neglect your emotions, and I'm basically not going to validate your emotions as being valid. The neglect response is oftentimes engaged in by people who have more power and more authority in a situation, as is often the exit response as well. If a person's got the authority or the power in the relationship, then they have more ground to exit and kind of distance from the conflict. The next response that the text talks about is the loyalty response. And the loyalty response involves staying committed to a relationship despite differences. In other words, the person who adopts the loyalty response as their response to conflict decides to stay in the relationship and to tolerate the differences. Loyalty response might be desirable if if in the relationship you value the relationship and the relationship level meaning of what's happening more than you value being right. And somebody recently apologized, and I thought it was a very poignant apology. They basically said, I'm not really saying that I'm wrong. I'm saying that my relationship with this other person is more important to me than being right. And oftentimes the loyalty response is a response that values the relationship as opposed to being correct. The last response is the one that the text indicates is the most healthy, and that's the voice response. And that's where you actually give voice to whatever it is that's irking you or causing you discomfort or pain. The voice response, according to the text, addresses the conflict directly and attempts to resolve it. People who often respond with the voice identify problems and tensions and assert a desire to deal with them. The voice response is usually productive because it communicates that there is a problem and that they value the relationship enough to, rather than just kind of neglect it and move on and pretend like no problem exists, they value the relationship enough to actually work to try to fix it and to try to come up with a win-win compromise. The voice response is not always the most appropriate. Oftentimes, if you're in a situation where you have very, very little power and you're expressing a voice response, if you choose to, respond to the conflict with voice response, and the other person chooses to respond to the conflict with exit or neglect, then the power dynamics just get further entrenched, and it becomes more difficult to actually resolve the conflict. In the next video, I'll talk about some different strategies for dealing with and resolving conflict using interpersonal communication.